I'm sorry, Joe. Good morning. I'd like to call to order the Human Resources Appointment and Equity Committee meeting. Today is Tuesday, March 20th. Council Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Call the roll, Ms. Brown.
Here.
Mr. Gallagher. Here. Mr. Jones.
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Here.
Ms. Conwell. Here. We have a quorum. Let the record reflect Ms. Baker is also in attendance.
Thank you very much. Do we have any public comment related to the agenda?
No, no one has signed in.
All right, the minutes are before you. I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes from the March 6th, 2018 meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. If there are no questions, comments, or concerns, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. All right, we will move on to matters referred to the committee. Council Clerk, if you'll read the first item into the agenda.
Resolution number 2018-0052, adopting various changes to the Cuyahoga County non-bargaining classification plan.
All right. If you'll please state your name for the record and where you're representing and this legislation that's being introduced.
Good morning,
There you go.
Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee. I'm Albert Bushaheen, the Manager of Classification and Compensation for the Personnel Review Commission. Before you for your consideration are modifications to the county's non-bargaining classification plan. Changes in departments' operational needs, routine maintenance necessitate the revision of 4 classifications, the creation of 1 new classification, and the deletion of 5 classifications. All the modifications before you were prepared by the PRC Class and Comp staff, who's worked extensively with the Department of Human Resources and department management teams to ensure that they're fully informed of the proposed changes. In accordance with the PRC rules, the proposed changes were posted on the PRC's website prior to your consideration today. The PRC considered and approved recommending these changes to you at their February 21st, 2018 meeting. Madam Chair, we're requesting that these recommendations be approved under second reading suspension of rules. I thank you for your consideration. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns from the committee with regards to the classification changes?
What's the emergency?
Mr. Gallagher.
Ma'am.
Madam Chair, Councilman Gallagher, these changes some of them are necessitated for the operational needs of the departments, and the process is quite long and lengthy that prior to recent changes to our administrative rules, we were required to post these for 20 days on the PRC's website prior to the PRC even considering them and bringing them to you to go through the council's legislative process.
And the emergency is?
These are changes requested by departments and due to their operational needs. This process takes 2 to 3 months at the shortest. I mean, we can certainly wait if that's your desire, but we're trying to expedite this matter to ensure that these changes that they requested get done timely.
And if I may interject, I do believe these were originally going to be for our review, but due to some of the administrative rules that we needed to review as far as internal testing and job postings, they were postponed. So in part due to some of the things we needed to clear up. So.
And Madam Chair, Councilman, also recent changes in our administrative rules now will allow us to only post them for 7 days prior to the PRC approval rather than 20, which will shave off a couple of weeks as well.
Thank you.
And if you recall, recently I understand the HR and the PRC have come to some conclusion with regards to internal job postings. So this affords us the privilege to move on that now. So you're welcome. Any other questions, comments, or concerns from the committee? Councilman Miller.
The one that's a new classification, is there any immediate plans to fill that position?
Madam Chair, to Councilman Miller, there are 2 current incumbents that are currently classified as Program Officer 1s. That classification is very broadly written. This classification was developed to better reflect what these individuals do. At this time, there are no plans to add any additional FTEs. The 2 people that are currently classified as Program Officer 1s will be reassigned to this new classification. There's no budgetary impact.
And it looks like you're deleting CAD technician and you're adding a CAD technician 1 and a CAD technician assistant. Well, those are revisions. Could you explain what's going on with these CAD positions?
Sure, Madam Chair, Councilman Miller. We've taken the essential functions of the CAD technician, which is an old classification that was under the Board of County Commissioners class plan, and taken those essential functions and collapsed the classification series from 3 classifications into 2. So there's currently no incumbent in the CAD technician class. We've taken those essential functions and just placed them in the new revised updated CAD Tech 1 and CAD Tech Assistant.
And is the technician one, is that the same pay grade or an upgrade in pay grade?
The pay grade for both the revised CAD positions did not change, Councilman.
And do any of the positions being deleted have incumbents?
They do not. All these positions have no incumbents. We've worked with the Department of HR and the Department Management to ensure that they have no plans to fill these in the future.
And do any of the changes have budgetary impact?
They do not.
All right. If there are no further questions, comments, or concerns, I'd like to make a motion to move this to the full body of the council under second reading suspension. Do I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved in second. If there are no questions, comments, or concerns, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you very
Thank you.
much. This will move to the full body of the council. Council Clerk, will you read the next item into the record?
Resolution number 2018-0054, confirming the county executive's reappointment of various individuals to serve on the Child Abuse and Child Neglect Regional Prevention Council of the Ohio Children's Trust Fund.
All right, thank you very much. Looks like we have a familiar candidate for the first recommendation. So, Mr. Miller, Councilman Miller, if you would kindly give us a little bit of an overview and speak to the Council of the Ohio Children's Trust Fund.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present my candidacy for appointment to the 4-County Regional Prevention Council on Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. I'd like to thank the executive for giving me this very significant opportunity. Like my initial election to county council, when I was appointed to one of Ohio's 8 regional prevention councils in 2016, I joined a newly created council. Because of that startup experience, I was chosen as this prevention council's first chair, which also extended my term through June 2019, necessitating this additional appointment at this time. Getting the Prevention Council up and running required political rather than technical leadership on my part. With the help of my Cuyahoga County colleagues Robin Martin, Jennifer Grossman, and Levine Ross, and all the council members, we forged a close-knit council dedicated to providing quality prevention services in each of our 4 counties, Cuyahoga, Lake, Geauga, and Ashtabula. The process that the state set up is cumbersome and clunky, requiring multiple approvals to get anything done. I helped provide the right mix of collaboration and prodding with our state contacts and our coordinating entity at UH to get this process moving. I oversaw the process of writing our prevention plan, sending out RFPs, and making decisions on contracts. Through these efforts, we now have 7 organizations providing prevention services. UH Mom Power, Catholic Charities, YMCA of Greater Cleveland, Applewood Family Pride, Women's Safe, and Bright Beginnings. And we are working with ESC, the Educational Services Center of Cuyahoga County, to start services under the FAST program. I also led efforts which have just recently been approved to create a significant public awareness primary prevention program as a complement to our work with at-risk families. I am confident that this balanced approach will move the needle on child abuse and neglect prevention in our region. We have made a strong start, but it is still a fragile beginning, and I ask your support to continue this important work.
Well, Councilman Miller, I think you have the full body of I might be speaking out of turn, but I know that you have been a hard worker, very diligent in all things that you do. So I certainly am happy to support your reappointment. I'll open up the floor to our colleagues for any questions, comments, or concerns relative to Mr. Councilman Miller. Yes, Councilman Jones.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, Councilman Miller, I have no doubt about your ability and capacity to serve. But I'm sitting here thinking, this is the first time I've seen a council colleague have to stand in front of us. So that's a little different. So I'm actually more wondering about the procedural. Do we not have a council appointment to this position? What is it that brings you before us in this way as opposed to a typical?
According to the state law, which established the 8 regional prevention councils, each county gets to appoint 2, and the legal assumption that we've made is that when there's generic descriptions of appointments being made by the counties, that the process is that the county executive makes the recommendation and then it's up to confirmation by the council. So that's the process that we're using.
Okay. Well, the executive made an excellent choice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just for Councilman Jones, we have the privilege of having Councilman Miller come on, and with you being the newest member, one of the newest members. So this is the second time I've had the privilege of seeing Councilman Miller do his presentation in front of the body. But it's the standard procedure for this particular position. Councilwoman Conwell?
I would mention also that that there is another process where people can apply to the state Ohio Children's Trust Fund for appointment to one of these councils, and in fact, since ours is the smallest council, we only have 4 counties, which means a base of 8 members. There's councils in rural Ohio that have 16 counties, which gives them 32 members. So we were actually encouraged to take advantage of that, and I encouraged Levine from our staff to apply, which she did. So she was appointed to the council through that alternate route, as was one other person from Ashtabula County. So we actually have a total of 10.
Oh, awesome. Councilwoman Conwell?
Through the chair to Councilman Miller, do you have to recuse yourself when the vote comes up? I don't remember last time. Or are you allowed to vote for yourself? I don't remember how you did
I'll
last
yield
time.
to Mr. King or the law director.
Since you're a member of this body.
I mean, I'd have to take a look at that issue. I'm not exactly sure right now, so I don't want to advise you on something that I'm not clear on.
Well, I think we have enough votes to secure your appointment if you would recuse yourself, just for the record, to avoid any controversy or
I
confusion.
think that probably would be safe, yes.
All right, thank you.
All
Any
right.
other?
Yes. Councilman Miller, can you set up and have the Ohio Children's Trust, can you present in front of the HHS committee?
I would love to do that. We have done a lot of very important work, and I think that not as much attention has been given to this as we should try to. We should try to do it sometime next month, because next month is Child Abuse Prevention Month.
Very good.
So we should try to do it next month sometime.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, thank you, Councilman Miller. If our next candidate will come forward, Ms. Robin Martin. If you'll please state your name and your desire to be reappointed, your name for the record and your role and why you'd like to be reappointed to this body.
Good morning, Robin Martin, Director of Family and Children First Council. I've actually been working with the Ohio Children's Trust Fund for about 10 years. We worked with the trust fund through Family and Children First Council prior to the changeover to the new council structure. I think very important work we do to try to prevent child abuse and neglect in our communities. And the programs that we have looked at through the council process, I think will in fact do that in our region. As Councilman Miller said, we do have the smallest numbers of county, but we have, I think, the largest number of residents for the state of Ohio in that region. And the process has been very fair to make sure that each county, even our large county who has fewer residents, Ashtabula, but that we have something that reaches all families across the entire region. There was not a sole focus just on Cuyahoga. I think the committee has worked very well together, and I would really like to have an opportunity to see this process through. We're in our first year of appointing many of our programs, and I would really like to see how the evaluations for these programs work out and to see if there are other opportunities for us to assist young people and families in our collective communities.
Thank you very much. I will open up the floor to my colleagues for any questions, comments, or concerns with regards to Councilman Miller.
I just want to make a statement that Robin has been an outstanding council member. As I noted, this new council system that we were given to implement, it's not totally user friendly, and it has its challenges, and there's been some times where our state counterparts have taken some odd and contrary positions, and where some pushing back and prodding has been required, and Robin has been an upfront, no-nonsense kind of person, which has been extremely valuable to have on this council. So I just put forward my strongest possible recommendation for Robin. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Miller. I can also echo those sentiments. Ms. Martin has demonstrated a no-nonsense type of approach here at the county in her role with us, and so I trust that she does not change and that is a valuable asset wherever she goes. So I too would support your appointment and reappointment to this body. And if there are no further questions, comments, or concerns, do you know if when the next meeting will be, if we need to move this under second reading suspension?
The next meeting is scheduled. Well, the one at the end of the month has been. It's going to be pushed into April.
So I'll make the motion to move this under the full body of the council under second reading suspension. Do I have a second?
Second?
All right, it's been moved in second. If there's no questions, comments, or concerns, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you very much. Congratulations. And this will move to the full body of the council. Council Clerk, will you please read the next item into the record?
Resolution number 2018-0055, confirming the county executive's appointment of Kenneth Surratt to serve on the Cuyahoga County Tax Incentive Review Council for an unexpired term ending 12/31/2018.
All right.
Good morning. Thank you, Council Chairwoman and Council Committee. My name is Lisa Rocco. I'm the Director of Operations for the Cuyahoga County Fiscal Office and also the Chairperson of the County Tax Incentive Review Council through 2018. The Tax Incentive Review Council was created under Ohio Revised Code 5709.85 and directs the Tax Incentive Review Council to review all agreements granting exemptions from property taxations once a year. Marionette Richardson Scott was appointed to a 2-year term ending in 2018. Ms. Scott resigned from the Cuyahoga County Planning Commission effective the end of February 2018. So the Fiscal Office has recommended to the executive that Ken Surratt be appointed for the remaining term of Marionette Richardson Scott. Ken is the Deputy Director of Housing and Community Development, who works with each individual municipality, village, and township in Cuyahoga County to revitalize and stabilize the community tax base. Ken also serves as the executive's appointee on the Cuyahoga County Budget Commission and his experience and knowledge of each individual taxing authority allows him to understand the needs of each community in Cuyahoga County, and this experience will allow him to become a valuable contributor to the Tax Incentive Review Council.
Thank you very much. Big shoes to fill with Ms. Scott. I think she's moving to taking her talents to the South. So if you would like to come up, Mr. Surratt, and speak on your behalf as relates to your desire and skill set to serve on this council, I think that would be helpful.
Sure, to the chair and council members. Again, my name is Ken Surratt. When approached about this specific position, I actually thought it was a logical extension of the work I already do here for Cuyahoga County. As Councilman Jones is chair of the Community Development Committee and Councilman Gallagher is on the committee as well, have heard about the county housing plan. One of the major emphasis of that plan is about protecting the property tax base. We do it through demolition and housing renovation programs, through the investments that we make through the mini grant and your community supplemental grant programs as well. While we definitely want new development to add to that base, we understand that sometimes incentives are necessary to kind of help bring future benefits to and stabilization to the property tax base. So this is important to make sure that we honor those commitments that were in those agreements, that the people that receive those incentives honor that agreement. So again, I see this as an extension of the work that I currently do, as well as being familiar with as the Budget Commission appointee, seeing how that affects the tax base and improving those rates every year. Again, I feel it's consistent, and I'm honored that I was recommended and that you all will consider me as a candidate. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. I'll open it up to the floor to the colleagues. Any questions, comments, or concerns from my colleagues? All right, there being none, will this need to be moved under second reading suspension?
Yes, please,
All
so
right.
we can schedule the meetings.
Okay, excellent. We will make that concession for you. I'll make the motion to move this before the full body of the council under second reading suspension. Do I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved in second. If there's no questions, comments, or concerns, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. All right, thank you very much. We will move this to the full body of the council. Council Clerk?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Going back for a moment to the one on the Prevention Council.
Yes, sir.
First, I would like if the clerk could mark my vote as recused on that item. And secondly, the March 29th meeting was canceled, and the following meeting will not be until sometime in May. So if someone would like to make a motion that we revert to 3 readings as opposed to recommending suspension, we have plenty of time.
I'm comfortable with moving it forward under second reading suspension. So,
Okay.
thank you.
Fine. Okay.
Appreciate it. Item E, please. I'd like to go a little bit out of order, Council Clerk, and get item E before us, and then we'll come back to item D.
Ordinance number 2018-004, amending sections 303.02, 303.03, and 303.05 of the Cuyahoga County Code to update the Civil Service Code of Cuyahoga County.
All right, thank you very much. If someone will please come forward and state your name and why you'd like to move this legislation, why this legislation is before us.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. Rebecca Kupczynski for the Personnel Review Commission. The proposed changes in front of you today are actually here in front of this committee for a second time. They were here last year at the same time that we proposed a number of changes to our administrative rules. Those rules changes were approved at that time, but this language in the code was held at that point. There were some issues of disagreement between the administration and the PRC regarding some additional language in the code that has since been resolved. And so we are back in front of you asking to move forward with these code changes at this point. The basic premise, without going into a lot of detail at this point, the basic premise of most of these changes was to relax some of the bureaucracy that is inherent in some of the civil service process and to give a little bit more latitude to both the applicants and to the county administration in our processes. So happy to answer any questions about the specific changes, but basically that's it.
Thank you very much. Any questions, comments, or concerns from my colleagues on the committee? All right. Thank you very much. There being none, is there a motion to move this to the full body of the council?
So moved.
Is there a second? All, and 3 readings, are we okay to do this? Okay, thank you very much. It's been this long.
Yeah, right.
Okay,
Thank you.
so
Appreciate
we'll move this to the full body of the council under 3 readings. It's been moved in second. If there are no further questions, comments, or concerns, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you very much. This will move to the full body of the council. And if we can go back to item D, Council Clerk.
Ordinance number 2018-0001, providing for modifications to the adoption of the Cuyahoga County Human Resources Personnel Policies and Procedures Manual to be applicable to all county employees.
Okay, and if I understand correctly, we are the introducers of the proposed substitute, but we're going to have our staff present the amendments and the proposed changes. So if you'd kindly introduce yourself to our viewers and those here in the chambers.
Certainly. Michael King, council staff.
Trevor McLear, council staff.
All right, and you have a presentation. Will it be?
We do. Madam Chair, you have a hard copy in front of you as well as on the computer screen. We just wanted to quickly go over what's in front of you today. You've got the PowerPoint, as we already mentioned, plus you have a proposed substitute ordinance, as well as a proposed substitute HR policy manual, which is part of the ordinance, but 2 separate documents. So you have that in your book, in your packet that was provided by the clerk staff. What we wanted to do first before we get into the PowerPoint itself is give a little brief background on why we're here today. This particularly came out of the internal audit department's payroll audit that was originally conducted for the time period January 1 through December 31st, 2014. The internal auditor, when they were conducting their internal audit, extended that time period through December 31st, 2016, and issued a final report around September of 2017. We were in this committee a couple months back discussing some of those issues. We have actually pending legislation sitting in committee regarding that, which is actually incorporated in this proposed substitute to some degree. But this has been going on for approximately 15 months now. So this is a result of the new HR director, Douglas Dykes, coming in, wanting to update the previous HR procedure manual, plus some of the changes from the internal audit. So this is a combination of both of those things coming together over the last 15 or so months. We've had plenty of time to sit down with each of you and discuss some proposed changes, which is incorporated into our presentation that we'll go over. It has changed slightly since we met with each of you, that we will highlight those changes and go over each of those changes again for the public and the members in the audience here today. So if it's okay with you, we'll start the PowerPoint presentation. Mike and I will be tag teaming the presentation and going back and forth. So.
So the first thing we wanted to touch on, because this is a HR policy governing basically all employment with the county under the county executive and council, there are a number of minor amendments that we heard from council members that would be included. We're going to touch on some of the bigger issues later, but we wanted to run through some of the highlights here. We're not going to touch on every single one, but we can obviously answer questions as they might come up. So beginning on slide 2, the first one I'd like to call out relates to the county's equal employment section. The proposed HR manual that was introduced adds a couple of categories to protected classes, most notably gender identity and expression, status with regard to public assistance, and then prohibit discrimination on the basis of association with an individual that falls into a protected category. And while we heard general support from individual members for expanding the protected classes, we heard some concerns that the third category might be overbroad and would be difficult standard to enforce. And this was a concern that was echoed by the Personnel Review Commission in the letter they sent over last week. So we're proposing to strike that third category, but include the other 2 additional categories. The second point on this slide that we want to highlight relates to the posting of job openings. Currently, the proposed manual indicates that all external job postings will be posted publicly, but that there may be an internal opportunity that would only be posted internally. For reasons of transparency and consistency with how state and federal governments do this, we're recommending a change to the manual that will require that all job postings be posted publicly. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody necessarily gets to apply. If it's an internal posting, then it would be marked on the job opening, but it would still be, everybody would still be able to see that those jobs were posted publicly. So if there are no other questions about items on this slide, we're going to move to slide 3.
I would like the record to reflect that in attendance we have Councilman Brady, Schron, and Tuma. Thank you.
So the first item I'd like to point out on this slide relates to internal promotions for classified employees. As we discussed individually, the language that's introduced talks about an internal promotional process that may or may not go through the PRC. As the director of the PRC mentioned earlier, there is an agreement that was struck between the HR department and the PRC, and we anticipate a proposed charter amendment will be coming for you. It's going through the Charter Review Commission, but it will come to council later this summer that deals with that issue. And this amendment is in anticipation of that proposed charter amendment. So it may not. This may need to change at some point down the road, but for now, it's simply meant to reflect the agreement that was struck between the PRC and HR. Additionally, as was discussed at a previous committee, the proposed substitute strengthens language to encourage use of a compressed work week, and that is having employees work 10 hours a day, 4 days a week. Where doing so could realize cost savings for the county, improve access to county services, or employee morale. The third item on this slide would be modifying the anti-bullying policy. The new proposed policy includes an anti-bullying policy. This is being added to the existing anti-harassment policy. Currently, the anti-bullying policy has somewhat of a strict liability standard, meaning that the intent of any alleged bully is irrelevant, and that standard seems somewhat draconian given the subjective nature of individual workplace circumstances and how things may be perceived. So we amended that back to a reasonable person standard. So instances of bullying in the workplace would again come down to working it out between employees and supervisors, and it would use a standard reasonable person standard, which is usually the type of legal standard you'd want to look at in something in that realm. There was also language removed, or I shouldn't say removed, amended relating to gestures and glances, again, very subjective, that was amended to change to nonverbal threatening types of bullying. So if there are no other questions on slide 3, move to slide 4. On this final slide of minor amendments before we get to some of the bigger topics, we added a provision allowing employees or the county to record pre-disciplinary conferences. These meetings are usually required before discipline can be imposed on classified or bargaining employees. And the contents of these meetings are often relevant, and if an employee decides to appeal a particular disciplinary action, allowing for recording of these meetings helps establish a record of that decision-making process when discipline is imposed. The second item on this slide I want to call out relates to a new policy that the administration is proposing that would allow employees to forego healthcare benefits and instead receive a taxable opt-out payment. This actually does save the county money because usually the opt-out payment will be less than what the county would have paid in either premiums or direct claims for those employees. We are proposing 2 small amendments to this item. First, that to be eligible for the taxable opt-out payment, an employee has to provide proof of alternative coverage. This is sort of implied in the administration's proposed language, but we wanted to make it more explicit. And then secondly, we wanted to make sure that opt-out payments are offered uniformly to employees so that you don't have some employees offered some opt-out payments and others not. It doesn't specify a particular dollar amount, but that dollar amount would theoretically be developed during open enrollment, and employees could make an informed decision when selecting their healthcare coverage, whether or not to take the county's healthcare coverage or whether or not to take the taxable opt-out payment. So that sort of covers the highlights of some of the minor amendments. Are there any questions on any of the minor amendments discussed or not?
Councilwoman Conwell.
Through the chair to Mike, you said that they must show proof of insurance?
They have to show proof of alternative insurance if they are taking the taxable opt-out payment, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Baker.
Yes. I'm just curious, for those employees that are aging and reach Medicare age, how does that work with, I think it's mandatory that they would receive Medicare instead of the health care provided by an employer?
Yes, we actually asked this question of our HR department. They are actually not required to take the county's insurance. So they're eligible to receive the taxable opt-out payment under the proposed language.
Please proceed. Thank you.
All right. Moving on to slide 5. This issue, this is a section early on in the handbook, and this issue came up, if you recall, late last fall. Council introduced the legislation to amend the current handbook to significantly restrict the management's rights in the handbook, and this is again something that gives the administration flexibility to manage its workforce when things come up that aren't otherwise governed in the manual. So the administration introduced a modified version of this section, and we're proposing 3 amendments to it. First, we struck language that would allow the county executive to waive any provision of the handbook. Second, we inserted language limiting management rights where a particular practice or policy is explicitly prohibited, either in the handbook or in another policy approved by council or general law or collective bargaining agreement. And then third, we added language requiring human resources to log instances when this section is utilized to justify managerial decisions. And part of the thought process behind this amendment was to really keep tabs on when this section, which was utilized in the past, perhaps beyond what was originally anticipated by council, so that council knows when the administration is using this rationale to justify a managerial decision. Any questions on this item?
No.
Councilman Miller? No. Councilman.
So, Madam Chair, Mr. King, am I correct that as it's now worded, that that everything that's written in the manual is to be fully complied with, and that the managerial rights section only applies to things that aren't covered in the manual, because you can't cover everything. So that that if there's something that's not covered in the manual, then the administration can use its discretion under this provision. But when they do that, it'll be logged so that we have a record of it. Is that the summary of how it now reads?
I think it's an accurate summary of how it now reads. I would sort of qualify that to say that there may be some things that are governed in the manual. There may not be limiting language. So for instance, there may be situations where the manual might include examples or illustrations of particular practices or policies that may not be the only practice or policy that could come up in a particular situation. So in that instance, there may be some discretion, some administrative discretion, but when it comes to issues that there is clearly only one practice or policy that's permitted, or where there's language explicitly prohibiting a practice or policy, that discretion is no longer there.
Councilwoman Conwell.
Same question as Councilman Miller, but I'll ask a different one. So it says that any provision requested to be waived in this handbook must first be approved by the county executive or designee.
So just
Usually we,
right.
okay.
To be clear, this language was language that was inserted. It is not in the current manual. This was added in the administration proposed handbook. We are in our proposed amendments would be deleting that language.
Okay, okay.
All right, please proceed.
All right, I'm gonna hand it over to Trevor here.
Madam Chair, I forgot to add one thing during our opening remarks, that we as staff are asking for the committee to consider sending this out of committee as adopted for second reading adoption at the next meeting in March, mainly because our state auditor is currently conducting the 2017 audit, and discussions with them, which we're going to get to in a little bit. We would like a completed, approved handbook with some retroactive language that we will cover in a couple slides, but I did want to mention that during my opening remarks that we are requesting as staff that this be considered by the committee about potentially approving this under second reading adoption at next Tuesday's meeting.
Thank you.
So the next slide deals with the timekeeping section on page 23 of the proposed handbook. And what our proposed amendments will do is remove the language allowing for senior level employees to attest to working 80 hours versus filling out a daily timesheet. This is a new policy that was being proposed under the administration, but historically here at the county, every employee from top down has filled out a daily timesheet Sunday through Saturday, every hour worked and any hour taken on paid leave. So we are proposing that we continue with that practice and continue to require that every employee fill out a timesheet reflecting the times and dates that they work or that they take leave. So it is to continue the current practice that we have historically done at the county and not allow for the assessment of 80 hours worked.
Councilman Tryon.
So this is nothing new that you're asking by the elimination of the administration's language, is that correct?
That's correct, Councilman.
Okay, so anybody that would not be following this written procedure more than likely would be in violation, as I think as Mr. Miller was talking about.
Yes, that's correct, because this requires every employee to fill out the daily timesheet. So if it didn't, if an employee was not, it would be in violation of.
So this has required and it continues to require based on this language.
I don't know, I would say that our proposed language here is clearer than what's in the current HR policy manual. So if this language is adopted, it definitely would require an employee to do that.
To that point, if I can interject, the current HR policy manual says that all employees are generally required to complete a timesheet. And so the word generally in that sentence has been used to justify potentially alternative practices in limited circumstances. But the new language in the policy manual is clear. Every employee has to record their time.
So you as a lawyer would interpret the word generally does not mean always then?
Correct.
Thank you.
Any further questions on timekeeping?
Yes.
Councilman Miller.
So am I assuming that the word generally is not in the current version
That's correct.
recommended? Okay.
Councilman Gallagher.
Is anywhere in the handbook made clear that if there's falsification of these timesheets, that there's a punishment?
Yes.
Yeah. There is a discipline section related to.
And is that a criminal punishment or is that an in-house punishment? Because a falsification of a timesheet would be theft in office.
I believe you're correct in that statement. The handbook isn't a criminal code, so it doesn't necessarily come to that. But I believe there are statutes, criminal statutes on the books for time theft.
Which is why, I kind of wanted everybody punching in and punching out because this could be a slippery slope. And I don't want employees pointing fingers at one another, and it goes to the fairness of everything, everybody following the same thing. So while this is
Councilman Gallagher.
better, this isn't perfect, and I don't think punching in and punching out is perfect either for certain situations, but
I do believe, Councilman Gallagher, that this proposed language at least makes it fair for all employees following the same rules.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Conwell?
So through the chair, just wanted to follow up. So the senior staff have not been following this rule because of that word generally? Is that what we're saying? For some employees?
It's our understanding that there are some employees who have been attesting to working 80 hours within the biweekly pay period, which under federal labor law is an acceptable practice for those employees. And as discussed, the current manual, while it does require employees to generally requires employees to record their time, it doesn't explicitly limit it to all employees. So it's our understanding that a very few number of employees have in the past attested to working at least 80 hours during a given work period instead of recording their time down to the minute.
So by taking that word out generally, it's going to be expected of all staff, no matter what role.
That's the intent of our amendment, correct?
Okay, so there will be no follow-up on, since it was the federal language that you stated, there will be no follow-up on the ones that haven't been following this previously?
Well, council can adopt more stringent rules about how timekeeping works than is what is required under federal law. So that
Is that
federal law still
needed?
applies.
And from your opinion, is that needed, so this won't happen again?
That's ultimately up to this body. But if it's council's intent that all employees record their time in some form or fashion, whether it's by punching in or out or recording it on a daily timesheet, then this language is intended to achieve that.
Please proceed. Thank you.
On slide 7, which corresponds with pages 25 through 27 of the proposed substitute, relates to telecommuting. And in the proposed administration's HR policy manual, it had general provisions creating a new telecommuting program, which would have been new to the county. We, in discussions with the council members, the majority of council members, we believe maybe right now is not the best time to create a new telecommuting program. So what we did is remove those general provisions, creating a new telecommuting program. We added specific language prohibited permit telecommuting arrangements, but allowed the HR director to, in certain circumstances, to allow for temporary or occasional scenarios, which is limited to out of the office for dependent care, inclement weather, illness, and or caring for a family member. And that is the current practice that we currently do. It does require that the HR director to consult with the risk management to address some of the council members' concerns about any potential workers' comp liability. But it does continue to allow the current practice for the temporary or occasional circumstances where their employees need to work from home if their supervisor or manager and the HR director are in agreement.
You have a question, Councilman?
Yes. Am I correct that part of the problem with what was proposed was that it applied to higher level employees only, and that the intention is given the way the world of work is heading, maybe sometime down the road we might develop a broader policy, but if we did, it would apply to everybody and not just a small group of employees. Is that correct?
Councilman, you're correct. The proposed language that the administration had in the revised HR manual was for senior management level employees or above. The new policy, I think that we have heard from some of you down the road of creating a new telecommuting program, that it would apply to all employees if their job allowed them to work from outside of the work area.
Okay, right.
Councilman Gallagher?
Within this, as far as illness and things like that go, is there some documentation that's going to have to be submitted by the employee to the HR department or director?
Yes, the language was very clear, especially to your point earlier about accountability and timekeeping. There is express language in here about employees who work out of the office recording their time accurately and honestly, and puts an obligation on supervisors to ensure that their employees are in fact doing the work that they say they're doing.
Okay, and we had an instant this past winter where a snowstorm was coming in before noon, and many of the county buildings were emptied out, except for this one, and maybe some others. But the majority of the folks that worked in the courts and whatnot were sent home justifiably because the winter advisory was that people should not be on the roads. People that were in this building were held hostage by, in my opinion, the HR department's directive that they couldn't let anybody go. And there was a loose reasoning for that I challenge to this day. Is there anything that we have placed within the handbook that would make it, I guess we couldn't make it mandatory, but when there is a severe weather happenstance that we would have to let people go? I'd hate to hold folks hostage, send them home on highways that have been deemed by the state of Ohio and the National Weather Service to be dangerous, such as that instance this past winter. Is there anything that we could put in there to almost make it mandatory, or hold those that deem it unnecessary to let those employees go, hold them responsible for anything that might happen to those employees that are forced to travail home in inclement weather?
Yes, Councilman Gallagher, there is specific language in here that would allow for early dismissal. If I can spend a minute, a little history on that. Prior to the administration introducing proposed changes to the HR policy manual, the council president and the county executive requested that HR staff meet with council staff to go over any proposed changes that we thought as council staff that would be some concerns or suggested changes from council members. One of the proposed changes that we recommended to HR and the administration was to allow for early dismissal, for the example that you just provided. And when they introduced the final piece of legislation, they included early dismissal. So it specifically allows for early dismissal or late start in the case. In that case,
as well as building closure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councilman Shrine.
The point that Mr. Gallagher was raising was sending people home, but the way this provision is worded, this is telecommuting it's not necessarily one and the same, at least as I'm reading it.
That's correct. 6.13 governs early dismissal and delayed opening, and I believe the building closure as well, which is a separate section.
But if you were dismissing under that example, you could dismiss with the intent that they would telecommute and work from home for that 4-hour block of time and still provide services to the public.
Correct. It would depend on the nature of the work, but that's absolutely a possibility.
Okay, my question though that I wanted to ask was in regards to the word temporary. It sounds like that same kind of big word that you could drive a truck through. How have we defined the word temporary for purposes of this?
I think we don't define the word temporary in the language itself, but it is still contingent upon one of those 4 particular reasons being relevant. So there would have to be, either a clear, inclement weather event, an illness, or caring for an ill family member. There would probably need to be some type of documentation to extend that beyond, a short time frame. But the manual doesn't spell that out.
Because it just falls in that same kind of word as general. Unfortunately, my looking at it and whether or not it would be advisable to define temporary that gets reviewed every 30 days or every 60 days if illness or dependent care goes on beyond the beyond the Family Medical Leave Act or something of that nature. Some other standards that are already in existence in HR manuals, if we were to use the FMLA determinations of the 12 weeks or anything like that, just to give us a better definition of the word temporary in there.
Okay.
Councilwoman Conwell.
Through the chair to whoever, immediate removal if caught in regards to this telecommuting. So will that be,
The language that's put in place says that, hold on just one second. Falsification of time and attendance records may result in discipline. It doesn't specify immediate removal, but that is certainly on the table. There may be instances, depending on progressive discipline or collective bargaining agreements, where you have to go through the normal disciplinary process. So I don't know. That could be up to and including removal, but I don't know that we could specify that automatically an employee would be removed. They would still have to go through that due process unless they were an unclassified employee.
okay, would telecommuting require any outside, driving your car outside off your premises at home, or is it strictly in the boundaries of your home?
Telecommuting is defined as work not in the office, so it doesn't necessarily have to be from home. It could be from another location.
Okay, opening ourselves up for a lot of things with that one. Will there be hard copies of the HR manual, or is it just going to be on the website?
I would have to defer to HR on that. I think they're obligated to, when it's updated, distribute it to all the employees as practicable. That could be through posting it on our timekeeping system, MyHR, or it could be through distributing hard copies. But that would be an administrative decision.
Yeah, I just would think we should have hard copies when they update. 'Cause there's been a lot of updates.
Yeah, we certainly can get some for council.
And Councilwoman, I know hard copies are provided when requested, so it's always posted on the MyHR system. But I know HR in the past, if an employee does ask for a hard copy, they have provided hard copies.
There are no further, Ms. Councilwoman Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Along with temporary, if we could also take a look at occasional, that too could be something where we may need to define that a little better. And looking at page 25, it does say that possible reasons for temporary or occasional work arrangements include dependent care, inclement weather, recovery. So it is in that language, for what that's worth.
Thank you.
There are no further questions. Please proceed.
Okay, the next slide on slide 8 is related to executive and special compensation, which in your HR policy manual are pages 55 and 56, as well as pages 59 and 62. What we are doing with these proposed amendments are we are eliminating any executive and special compensation provisions. And we are also adding strict language prohibiting any form of direct or indirect compensation that is not authorized by council or a collective bargaining agreement or any other policy that council approves. Maybe one example is the upcoming travel policy that we know will be in this committee here in the next month or so. So it strictly prohibits any direct or indirect compensation not authorized by council. Pretty simple amendment. Okay, the next 5 slides will be related to the concern or issue about straight pay above 40 hours worked. What we did on slide 9, we wanted to just give the committee and members of the public how many employees we're talking about, because this has been a heavily discussed topic. The numbers are of March 2nd when we asked HR for this information. Of course, it could change on a daily basis, but as of March 2nd, there were 4,579 total number of employees under the county executive. This is who the HR policy manual covers. Out of those numbers, you can see there how many are bargaining, about 3,200, and a little north of 1,300 are non-bargaining employees. The next 2 bullet points tell you exactly how many non-exempt employees the county has, as well as the number of exempt employees. So when we're having these discussions above straight pay, the maximum number of employees that we're talking about is 967 employees of the 4,500 employees referenced above. So the maximum universe we're talking about is the 967. If you see from the last slide there, and as we mentioned in our opening remarks, This was addressed in the internal audits audit of payroll from 2014, which ended up extending through 2016. And there were 132 employees that received pay above 40 hours worked. A majority of those employees were in Health and Human Services, CCOMs, a couple in Fiscal, which is the appraisal department, and the medical examiner's office. So we're not talking about every single department with exempt employees. It's very limited in the certain situation where these employees were receiving straight pay above 40 hours worked. We think this slide's important just to paint the picture of the number of employees that we're talking about. The next slide there, we wanted to, I think, provide some clarification on some misconceptions about salaried or exempt county employees. Traditionally, when you hear salaried employees, you believe you get paid a set salary for the number of hours worked, regardless of how many hours it took one to complete the job. Here at the county, it's a little different, where each county employee is required to track their time. The majority of county employees are required to track their time down to the minute, including any use of sick or vacation leave. That includes pretty much every employee. So even though there are 900 or so exempt employees or salaried employees, we still have to account for our time down to the minute. If we work 38 hours, we have to use 2 hours of leave in order to get paid for 40 hours. If you work 38 hours and you don't have any vacation or sick, there have been some circumstances where that exempt employee will only get paid for the 38 hours because that employee does not have enough vacation or sick time. So you don't get paid for the 40 hours in some circumstances. The HR department will work with that employee and reduce that employee's pay by the 2 hours or whatever hours number of short that employee is for that 40-hour work period. So we think it's important just to kind of clarify the what it is as to be a salary exempt or a county salaried or exempt employee. So you are required to basically track every minute up to 40 hours worked, unless you work more than 40, which we're going to get into shortly. But just wanted to make sure the committee had a full understanding of a traditional salaried or exempt county employee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Of the 967, how many times has that occurred where we've actually docketed somebody?
So, Councilman, when we met with you, you asked that question.
I did.
We asked HR, and it's very labor intensive to get data. So what they did, and we received this information yesterday, which we forwarded to everybody this morning. So you probably didn't get a chance to look at it, but they took one pay period because it's easier for the staff to get us to paint a picture for us by pay period. I believe it was pay period 5. I could be wrong on that, but I think it was pay period 5. There were, I believe, 5 employees that were exempt, that did not work 40 hours and did not have enough vacation or sick, depending on why the person was out of the office, and was docked and only paid for the number of hours worked. So one pay period, there were 5 employees. And they offered to get us more, but it is pretty labor intensive until we get our new ERP system to be able to pull this kind of data. But they called and wanted to confirm it was okay to provide an example and choose one pay period, and we said yes, because we wanted to have that information for today's committee. So they were able to do that and show that 5 exempt or salaried employees were docked and only paid for the number of hours worked in one pay period.
Okay, thank you.
So moving on to the next slide, this committee heard from various department directors a few weeks ago, and that the practice of using straight pay for exempt employees is actually sometimes the only practical solution to meet the county's operational needs. And I think the committee raised many valid questions, and we've heard other valid questions from others as well about alternative solutions the county could pursue in lieu of paying straight time. But as this slide illustrates, in some circumstances, many of these alternatives can actually be more costly to county taxpayers than the practice of paying straight time. And I'm not going to go through all of these bullets because it's pretty thick follow text. But for instance, hiring additional employees or simply reclassifying salaried employees as hourly employees will almost always cost the taxpayer more, or the county more, and taxpayers, than paying straight time to existing staff. Because in those circumstances, either you're paying time and a half if you were to reclassify salaried employees to hourly employees, or you're paying additional expenses in the form of healthcare benefits, retirement benefits, or if you were to outsource the work to a private contractor, that's almost always going to be more costly than hiring in-house staff. So one item we wanted to highlight before we get to the proposed amendment, state law expressly contemplates that certain salaried county employees have the opportunity to earn compensation for work beyond 40 hours. This is a policy, this is a section of the revised code that this committee hasn't been presented with yet. We wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to see it. But I want to qualify this. This section does not justify past practices of the county because a formal policy is required to be adopted in order to do this. And that formal policy was never adopted. However, it suggests that if properly adopted, such a policy would be in accordance with state law. And as a charter county, this council has the opportunity to enact or to exercise its home rule powers to adopt HR policies as it sees fit as well. So moving on to slide 13. With all of that in mind, we tried to put together a policy that is accountable, transparent, and cost-effective while still meeting the business needs of the county. So what the amendment that we're proposing specifies is that straight time payments will only be allowed when all of the following conditions apply. First, the department director has to determine that there is an compelling operational need for exempt employees to work beyond 40 hours in a particular work week in order to meet an urgent public health, safety, or other compelling need. Second, the department director has to determine that hiring any additional employees or outsourcing the work would be impractical or less cost effective than using a straight time payment system. Additionally, the Director of Human Resources has to determine it would be either impractical or inequitable to expand the cap on the accrual of exchange time, extend the time frame in which an employee's exchange time can be used. And as a reminder, currently the policy is employees can only accrue up to 40 hours of exchange time in their bank of hours. If they work beyond 40 hours and already have hit that cap, they don't earn any more exchange time. And it has to be used within 6 months by the employee or it expires. They don't get a cash payout, it just disappears. So the new proposed handbook allows the HR director to provide flexibility in expanding that. I believe it's up to a year that the employee could use that time, and they could increase the bank of hours. I forget what the exact number is, but it's at least double the current 40-hour cap. And the HR director has to determine that it would be impractical or inequitable to modify an employee's base salary. So that was one of the things we had heard from this committee, was that, if these employees are genuinely working on a regular basis beyond 40 hours, that why don't we just modify their base salary? And so what this proposal would require is that if that is a practical or equitable solution, that should be considered before considering straight time payments. And then finally, the county executive would have to authorize the payments in writing, specifying the name of each employee authorized to receive the payments, the maximum total of hours they'd be eligible to earn for additional pay, and the period of time not to exceed 90 days when each employee is eligible to receive such payments. And this time period could theoretically be reauthorized, but it would have to come as a separate approval. And that's important for the last point on this slide, which is that all approvals or all authorized payments have to be listed on the county's personnel agenda, which is, as you know, a public record that's published on a semi-monthly basis at the time they are approved. So, if the county executive were to authorize the appraisal department, as an example, to work beyond particular 40 hours for a particular time frame to meet perhaps a state deadline, as this committee heard a few weeks ago, then that approval would be listed on the personnel agenda. So that is the proposal that we've heard, or that we're presenting here today. We've heard feedback from individual members, and it's been modified slightly around the edges, but this was our best attempt at meeting the concerns that we heard in previous committees and from individual council members.
Council President Brady.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Just to say, certainly thanks to the staff, as always, tremendous amount of work over several weeks, if not longer, that went into this. There's probably not a way to make a perfect document, but you've done, I think, a yeoman's job of trying. The report reflects several meetings that took place over a period of time with members of council. I believe it reflects pretty closely the best consensus, as far as I could determine, of where the council stands. There are marginal issues, I think, unless I'm missing something that we can continue to discuss. We can always amend any of this or add more in the future if that's something that we want to do or intend to do. And I think in some cases, we probably will want to look back into these things. We're going to be dealing with another document on travel time later on this year. But I wanted to indicate that there was a meeting that I attended with the state auditors representatives a week ago today. And it was the first face-to-face meeting that we've had with them about this issue. And they gave us some guidance, not as much as I would have maybe liked, but they did ask me some direct questions. I told them my opinion and what I thought the consensus of the council was, to be honest about that. And they did indicate that they would like to have us do something as soon as possible. Well, I knew that, but fortunately, they weren't asking us. They were only asking us after we had put in a great deal of work into it. So I didn't feel uncomfortable in terms of the position that we're in, because I think we've done the work, and I think we're 95% of where we need to be at this point. And I would appreciate if the council would allow this legislation to move on to the regular council for next Tuesday, not discouraging any more debate, not discouraging any amendments, not discouraging anything that anybody finds here that they don't feel comfortable with. There's always can be some wordsmithing, and there always could be some wordsmithing. So I wanted to let you know my view about where we're at this point with this legislation.
Thank you, Council President Brady. Councilman Miller.
A couple things. I would first say that I support the general direction that we're going on this section. One question I have is whether the archives of the personnel agendas are available someplace online where if you want to go look at the personnel agendas and see where this section was invoked, are you able to do that?
I don't believe the personnel agendas are currently posted online, but they are public records, and they are basically official sign-offs from either the county executive or the HR director for all employment actions, including hirings, firings, promotions, transfers, et cetera. So these are records that do exist and can be, we can look back and see exactly when this has been invoked.
How long are they required to keep them under the retention policy?
I don't know the specific answer to that question, but I do know we have several years worth of personnel agendas, and they go back to the prior form of government.
I would like to see this be a little more accessible. Either whenever this is approved, that a separate log is kept that can be referred to at any time, or else that there's some easier way of accessing these personnel agendas rather than having to make a public records request whenever you want one. So that's one suggestion I would have.
Councilman, if I can add, which we can potentially work on some language. I know that some of the media in Cleveland has an request that every time HR sends out the personnel agenda to various people, the media also get it. That's just the practice. It's been the practice under the commissioners that carried forth under the new form of government. So from a media perspective, they do receive these personnel agendas when it gets distributed to, like, say, county directors and other folks that request it. We get it approximately every 2 weeks, depending how often one is created. We keep ours. We have it on our shared drive, on our council shared drive as well. But there's potential we can work on some language addressing your concern there.
Okay. Second thing is the very last line in section 9.08 on page 121. It's the section we're talking about. The very last line says, "At no time shall exchange time be paid out to the employee." I know what you're driving at, that once exchange time is given, that it cannot later be paid out in cash. But to the casual observer, it seems to conflict with this language about that under certain circumstances it can be paid hour for hour, and I'm wondering if a few words to clarify that might be considered.
Yeah, we can certainly work with you to put together an amendment to clarify that. That sentence is actually in the current policy manual because that's how exchange time currently operates. The language that was added as part of this amendment says that these cash payments would be in lieu of exchange time, so they're not considered exchange time, they're considered a different thing. But if this, council wants to clarify that distinction, we can absolutely work with you to put together an amendment.
The final comment that I have is that the language tends in this direction, but I'm not sure that it's strong enough that the payment of hour for hours for extra time worked is supposed to be in response to a temporary situation or a situation that has peak times, but not an ongoing situation. But the way this is worded, you could authorize it for 90 days, and after 90 days you could authorize it again, and after 90 days you could authorize it again, and it could just be something that gets re-upped every 90 days but becomes a permanent practice, which I don't think is our intent here, but I think as this language is written, that's clearly allowable, and I think there should be some kind of provision that after it's done a couple of times, that it's got to be dealt with and another solution found.
I think that's a very valid point. I will say that there was some reluctance we heard from some of your colleagues about putting a hard cap on the extension of the allowable instances, just because you never really know when there's going to be an ongoing emergency of some kind where it may be needed. So, again, we can work with you to come up with some language that maybe addresses that concern. But that's sort of why we ended up where we did.
Councilman Tron, then Baker. Oh, I'm sorry. Councilman Miller, were you done?
Done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And picking up on the same point, we've used the 90-day window for the county executive. It just seems only appropriate that we should be doing something of putting a fence around that for the department director on this hiring practice, because it's something that can go on infinitum, and it looks like. Of the 132 people that have been identified, which represents around 15% of the workforce that's eligible in this category, how many of those are the same exact person time after time after time, to Mr. Miller's point?
I might defer to Trevor on this. I believe all 132 people are different employees, because currently there is no requirement to reauthorize. So if it were to continue in the same fashion it currently operates in, it would still potentially apply to those 132 individuals.
Most likely the same of the 967 group are being repetitive based on the groups you identified. You identified, I think, four basic work groups that they came out of. So is it also logical that these are the same exact people time after time?
I think that's correct, Councilman. I can work with our internal auditor just to get you clarification on that question, but it's pretty much reoccurring in those specific areas.
With probably those specific people?
More than likely. For an example, we heard from the HHS administrator at the last committee meeting, saying the reason why he needs this is because of the number of vacancies that are in that current positions that receive the straight pay above 40 hours, the supervisors.
Then that takes it right to the specific point of what I'm raising, which is item 2, that if there's vacancies, then we run the risk of burning out people if they continually work and work and work overtime and we don't find the right replacement candidates. And the argument about it costs more money, I disagree with that argument, because when you start losing people because they're burning out, it costs you more money to burn through people than it does to find the right mix. There's a reason we have the right mix, and item 2, I think, should have that same 90-day window that says you can only use this. You can't keep kicking the can down the road. You have to demonstrate what you've done to replace those individuals, not just say, I can't hire them out there in that respect. So I agree with Mr. Miller implicitly that the purpose of overtime is to fix temporary spikes. It's not to be a permanent way of doing business. And so we used the word temporary earlier on when we talked about telecommuting. I'm surprised that we don't have that same word appearing in this section, because it seems the temporary and occasional should be used just as importantly in this section as it was used in the other section out there. With all the focus on this one area, have other bodies reviewed our language that we have here, i.e. the prosecutor's office, i.e. our internal legal, i.e. it sounds like the county, our president has had conversations with the auditor's office, the state auditors, but have these other bodies looked at this language to feel comfortable with it?
This language has been shared with the prosecutor's office and the auditor of state's office, as well as the law department. We did not solicit feedback on this particular set of language. Most of our discussions were focused on the next couple slides that we'll be presenting, but they have received this language.
But acquiescence is not necessarily acceptance, so perhaps it would behoove us to get at least acknowledgement that yes, they agree with this language, because this is where some of this has precipitated some disagreements out there.
Councilman, we have heard specifically from our county prosecutor's office where they, and I don't want to speak for them, but I believe that they would probably have a disagreement on just the practice itself, allowing for straight pay above 40 hours for salaried or exempt employees.
That's the concept, not the legality of it.
Correct.
Right.
So we can certainly ask for them to provide feedback on the proposed language, but I'm just kind of letting the committee know where we have heard where they stand about the practice of it. So
I would appreciate having both the response specifically on the legal side, so we're comfortable that we're not going down a path that's going down a path that's inappropriate on that side. And the practice side is probably, from their standpoint, the what if their group is not following this same procedure, what problems, if any, is it going to create for them operationally within their business units if one part of the county is doing it and another part of the county is not?
Correct.
Thank you.
Please proceed. Sorry, Councilwoman Baker, my apologies.
No problem at all. Thank you, and I too would like to say thank you for all your hard work. I know you've spent a great deal of time and talked to all of us, and I appreciate that. I too have been struggling with the 9.08 section of this handbook, and from what I'm hearing, the 132 employees that we're really focusing on that have the potential to use the extra pay after 40 hours tend to be those that are related to public safety and public health. So I guess what I'm struggling a little bit with is why are we expanding that to other compelling operational needs? Why can't we, knowing that most of the 132 employees would probably fall in the category of meeting an urgent public health and safety, why can't we limit it just to that? And that anything above and beyond would have to either be the exchange time or the possibility of understanding that more employees are needed or understanding the circumstances and better ways of perhaps staffing. But when it comes to someone who is in urgent need of a home that a social worker needs to go in and take a child out, or other very dire issues that we deal with here in the county, those, of course, we would give that extra dollars and understanding that their services are needing beyond 40 hours a week. But when we start talking about other compelling, that to me seems to be interchanging words like temporary, like occasionally or generally, and it just allows perhaps a little more flexibility beyond what perhaps I'm comfortable with. If I can add just to that, in looking at the language on 9.08, just a suggestion, we have it listed as exempt employees, exchange/straight time, and perhaps to make it clear, as a suggestion, we could put 9.08A, that is only talking about straight time, and 9.08B, that is only talking about exchange time, so that we can really separate the regulations around each and defining what each is, just for clarity. But those were my two struggles with this section of the handbook, and again, I appreciate the amount of work that you put into this.
Thank you, Councilwoman. I know we spoke about this briefly, and again, staff would be happy to help you prepare an amendment if you're interested in introducing one. I think the reason we didn't limit it to public health and safety needs is partially because we heard, in particular from the fiscal office, they have appraisers. They currently have a practice of providing this type of compensation for who aren't, I don't know how others might define it, but I personally wouldn't define completing the real estate appraisal in time for the state deadline as a public health or safety need. Right. But it's still a state mandate, a state deadline that needs to be done, and a lot of times there are issues that come up that may be unexpected. Generally speaking, I would say from council members, we didn't hear a direct or express interest in excluding those employees from this opportunity. But if that's what council decides, it wants, the direction it wants to go in, then we can certainly have that conversation.
May I follow up, Chair? Is the fiscal office the only exception that you would determine this language would be impacting?
I think it could potentially also impact some of the employees in Health and Human Services. I think you could make a compelling health and or safety business case for certain employees or certain types of work that might take place in HHS. But I think there are a number of instances in the past where they've just been underwater related to, they have a high attrition rate, they're understaffed, they have a lot of high caseloads. And so I think this type of pay has been authorized in the past simply to meet some of the operational needs, but there are, I think, discrete circumstances that clearly meet the standard you're outlining and some that may not, so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, please continue.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to add a good example in HHS could potentially be the call center, where it's the supervisors, due to the high turnover rate, where the social workers are making sometimes more or very close to what the supervisors are making. From a business standpoint, they want a supervisor, at the call center 24/7, supervising the employees, where because of the number of vacancies, because of the turnover that happens so often in that department, where it might not fall under the public health or the safety, but from an operational standpoint, you would want a supervisor there to manage the employees. So that's really that, and the fiscal office appraisal division is probably the two best examples of the compelling operational need from our proposed standpoint.
If I may respond. I would give the supervisory role of what you just explained under public safety. I mean, I think that would be considered temporarily public safety, and we have to define temporary. Also, the medical examiner. I think there are times there where he is under a certain deadline, needs to get things done, and under public safety deadlines, that could also be. So I think that I would certainly expand what public safety and health is when it comes to what we're servicing for our constituents. But I'm just wrestling with the compelling operations of all other departments when perhaps it isn't the urgent need, only an easier way perhaps of getting the work done by paying more after 40 hours. And that's where I'm defining that difference. But I would certainly include as the description you gave as being a public safety issue, and medical examiner could also be listed under public health issue if they're in fact under a deadline that must be done and it impacts the welfare of our community.
Thank you. Please proceed.
So the next item in your presentation on page 14 is deals with retroactive authorization of past employment practices. And currently in the proposed ordinance submitted by the administration, retroactive language is included that would basically say all prior employment actions are hereby approved, including but not limited to payments to employees for work done in excess of 40 hours per week. The above language was submitted to the Auditor of State's office and the prosecutor's office, and in feedback we received from various parties, those as well as others, it was determined that that language was somewhat overbroad, vague, and may not be sufficiently specific to protect county employees. And that's an important element here. Retroactive language may be needed in order to protect employees against any potential liabilities arising from these prior HR practices, because if you have an employee who reasonably relied on a supervisor who asked them to work beyond a particular time frame and expected to receive pay, then there may be instances where it may be distasteful to try and recover from an employee who reasonably relied on that assurance, particularly potentially years after the fact. So modified language was submitted to the Auditor of State's office and the prosecutor's office. This was developed in conjunction with them. And the next two slides demonstrate the language that I think, while we haven't received 100% clear approval of, I believe we believe will be sufficient to satisfy the Auditor of State and his audit for 2017. So on page 15, it outlines a number of whereas clauses that would more clearly lay out the history and the rationale for ratifying particular past practices. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It sort of just lays out that these payments were made in the past, and that this language is intended and is limited to what is being approved here in the ordinance. And also clarifies that any current or future payments of compensation to these exempt employees have to be in accordance with the policy that council ultimately adopts going forward. So on the following slide, slide 16, this is the language that's actually going to be in the body of the ordinance pending council approval. And it basically only deals with the exempt employees who worked beyond 40 hours or employees who worked on holidays and received premium pay. And you can read, that's the text verbatim that's being inserted in the ordinance. And it, again, limits it to, it basically says council ratifies and authorizes payments to county employees that satisfy 4 criteria. 1, that the employee was designated as overtime exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act. 2, that they were compensated at their regular rate of pay for hours worked beyond 40 or received premium pay for working on a county holiday. 3, that the employee received prior authorization to receive such pay from a supervisor, and this may include approval of timesheets, things like that from directors who agreed to that condition on which they reasonably relied. And then 4, that the employee actually worked those hours beyond 40 that they were, or on a county holiday for which they were compensated. So if it turns out they didn't actually work those hours, then this does not cover those employees. I'm going to turn it over to Trevor for the last slide.
So before we get into,
Councilman Shrine has a
Back on that
question.
slide, would it be appropriate to be looking for a waiver of the employees so that we don't have a challenge as to whether or not they fall under what we have defined as exempt, and therefore potentially opening up us to a Fair Labor Standards Act where they're coming back and saying, no, those, you've already acknowledged you paid me correctly in exempt status for the straight time, but now I want time and a half because I really wasn't an exempt employee, and get a waiver from every one of these 137 individuals that are out there to make sure we cover. We're trying to cover our base with the auditor. Let's go and make sure we cover it the other direction as a thought.
That's an interesting idea. I will say, and I don't claim to be an FLSA expert, but I do believe that an employee is unable to waive their rights under the Fair Labor Standards Act without some type of consent decree from a court. So unless you got a judge to sign off on some type of action in that way, I don't believe any type of waiver in that case could be enforceable. But as I think, regardless of the county's practice of paying additional time, I don't think it would have a clear impact on someone's designation. There are clear legal standards as to whether or not you're designated hourly or salaried, and none of the factors in that test really deal with the rate of pay or the way you're compensated, other than some basic things that aren't included in straight time for work beyond 40 hours.
We're making a specific statement by what we're doing here is that we are doing this so there will not be a clawback in any way back to the employee. Seems to me that there's a contractual side that would allow for an agreement on both parties, and whether or not they would satisfy that this is a complete agreement satisfying both parties, that whatever we're doing retroactively will benefit both us and them in regards to that. And I would ask you at least to look into that.
Sure. Any other questions on this particular section? All right.
the last slide here ties in with what Mike and I mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, tying into what the internal audit found in the audit, the payroll audit. And the reason why this retroactive language that Mike just presented and what we're going to discuss here is important is because the state auditor is conducting the 2017 audit, and if this retroactive language is not included, the state auditor can find what's we've discussed with you, which findings of recovery, where it could mean that the employee or someone from the county would be responsible to pay these funds back potentially. That's there's a little bit more in the process there, but that's the importance of having this retroactive language. This last slide here is language that council was asked by the administration to include in the proposed substitute As you can see from the proposed substitute, this language was not included, but the language, we wanted to make sure the committee was aware, the proposed language would retroactively approve basically any special and executive compensation that has took place over the last couple of years. Again, it's not included in the proposed substitute, but we wanted to make sure the entire council, the committee, they knew that this was being requested of them. And it didn't make the proposed substitute based off feedback that we heard from a majority of the committee as well as the rest of council.
Thank you, gentlemen. Councilman Shrine.
So by taking this language out, then are we to assume that some people might be subjected to recovery for performance bonuses, relocation reimbursements, and things of that nature because they were not authorized in the core documents up to this point?
Councilman, we anticipated that question would be asked. So yes, the state auditor could potentially find findings of recovery, multiple findings of recovery potentially on the special and executive compensation factors that you just listed. They're currently conducting their 2017 audit. We anticipate completion around June, end of June. That's why we are also asking that that the proposed substitute gets adopted here soon, so the state auditor knows what council's intent and plans on doing. That's why we're asking for second read adoption. So ultimately, yes, Councilman, the state auditor could find findings of recovery and refer their findings to the county prosecutor's office.
And it gets back to my waiver question on the prior one, that this would not be any waiver of any of these things, and that the auditor could come after these individuals for these funds.
The prosecutor could go after the individuals, could escalate that to people above the employees, but that is something that we don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Council President
Just
Brady.
as a reminder, as we're having this discussion, that we can do the best we can, but we cannot completely anticipate what the state auditor, or more, I think, to the point, what the county prosecutor may do. So the county prosecutor and county auditor and state auditor still have the authority to go beyond anything we make a decision about anyway. So you need to keep that in mind, no matter how perfect we get. If we think it's perfect, and and I'm looking for perfection, they may not see it that way.
Yes, sir.
If I may add, when we met with the state auditor last week, we did ask, what audit period are you looking at? Are you going to go extend beyond 2017? At that point, the staff from the state auditor's office indicated that currently they're only looking at 2017. That doesn't necessarily mean that's where we'll end up come June. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that the county prosecutor's office would stop at 2017 as well.
Thank you. Councilman Miller.
Do we have any idea of how much money is involved in all of the fringe benefits, et cetera, involved in this slide that's in front of us that's not included in the ordinance?
We have a general ballpark of dollar amounts, but it really depends. When you're talking about executive comp and special compensation in particular, there are a number of these fringe benefits that are indirect forms of compensation, most notably, and probably the largest chunk of it being advanced exchange time. Again, that's time that cannot be cashed out, but can be used as paid leave by these employees. So it would really depend on how the auditor defines or quantifies these benefits in a dollar amount, because there are some instances, for instance, relocation reimbursements, where you can say, oh, this employee was reimbursed a fixed amount for a particular benefit. There are others where an employee may have been offered exchange time but didn't use it, or maybe they would calculate exchange time in a different way. So it really depends on the auditor of state and their approach to quantifying this. But I would say, if assuming the auditor confines the audit period to 2017, It's in the tens of thousands range.
And Councilman, if I may add to Mr. King's point, if someone used that advance exchange time in lieu of the vacation time that they earned, could potentially be additional dollar amounts there. So that's why it's a challenge to give you an exact number of what that equates to because of the indirect part of the executive and special compensation.
All right, thank you very much. If there are no further questions, comments, or concerns from the committee, I think our council president said it best. We do not want this the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And based on the request and the presentation of Mr. McAleer and Mr. King, I would like to make the recommendation to move this to the full body of the council under second reading suspension due to the time-sensitive nature of the legislation before us, as well as the amount of work that has been put into this, with the understanding that we do have some items that have been brought to our attention that may require some future consideration and amendments, and our staff has already committed to working with those individuals on those concerns. So if there are no further questions, comments, or concerns, I've made the motion. Do I have a second? It's been moved in second. If there are no further questions, comments, or concerns, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, this will move to the full body of the council.
Did we vote on the proposed substitute?
I thought we were working from the proposed substitute, but if not, if you will please kindly, my apologies. So how should we proceed?
Chairman, could we have a motion just to substitute with our proposed substitute, I think, just to clarify for the record?
Okay, for the record, we are moving to move this to the full body of the council under second reading suspension using the proposed substitute. And I've made the motion. Is there another second? All right, it's been moved in second. No further questions, comments, or concerns. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No opposed. This will move to the full body of the council. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Council Clerk, do we have any public comment unrelated?
No, no one has signed in.
No miscellaneous business from the committee? There being none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention.
He told me he was white. He goes, all white people